Hey guys, we are back in our world history curriculum up to Unit 4 now, and Unit 4 is all about this thing called imperialism. So, of course, buried within that word imperialism is empires. So empires are basically countries that grow larger and larger by conquering lands around them, adding them to the original country. As they do so, they often gain land that belongs to people of other ethnic groups or religions, and this can often lead to some problems. So we're going to figure out today why imperialism was really kind of a world trend in the late 1800s, what caused it, and then later in this unit we're going to kind of go region by region around the world and try to figure out how imperialism affected the people of the world. But before we do all that, we need to first figure out again what the causes of imperialism is all about. And then again, like I said, we're going to apply this to Africa, Asia. We're going to look at Japan and how they're going to modernize, become an imperial power themselves. And we'll also look at America and what we're doing in Latin America. All right, so let's try to figure out what the origins of European imperialism was in the 1800s. So we need to first figure out why countries would build an empire in the first place. And there could be economic reasons, there could be political reasons, there could just be, human nature and greed, always wanting more. But as empires get larger and larger, of course, they're going to run into some problems. It might be that the empire is far away from the mother country. It might be that the people in the empire don't want to be ruled by the mother country. And so, there are all kinds of issues that are going to arise around imperialism. So let's define imperialism. Put very simply, we're going to call imperialism the domination of one country's affairs by another country. Now, this could be, an invasion and conquering and establishing a new government for a region, or it could be more like economic imperialism, where your economic system is more or less forced on another region. It could be cultural imperialism, where your values, like say religion or language or something, are often forced on another group or accepted by that group. But for our purposes, we're going to focus more on kind of the first type, where one country is coming in and conquering and claiming that land as their own. And a good example of this will be one of the great empires in all of history. That's the British Empire. So Britain, at one time or the other, owned everything you see there on your map in pink. Now, again, they didn't own all this at the same time, but at one time or the other, all of these areas had a British flag flying. All right, well, let's get into our main idea number one and talk about how these colonies were built. So, number one, what caused imperialism? Nationalism. So in our last unit, we covered what nationalism was. We looked at how it motivated people, how it created division, but also unity. And we're going to find out that nationalism is one of the great motivators of European imperialism, because country A, well, maybe it's Germany, maybe it's France, whatever, they have rivals, country B, C, and D all across Europe. And by having more territory, more land, that gave your country more power. It increased the pride of the people in that country, increased their nationalism, and so there's always this competition among Europeans to have more land overseas. And we see that competition in this quote from a German historian named Heinrich von Treitschke. He writes, "All great nations in the fullness of their strength have desired to set their mark upon barbarian lands, and those who fail in this great rivalry will play a pitiable role in time to come." Now, barbarian means, in this context, undeveloped or kind of uncivilized, as they would have called them back then. So again, there's this great rivalry, great competition. You've got to keep up. If you don't, your country is going to fall behind and be a lesser country. Now, for our next reason why imperialism is growing, we're going to look at this poster. And it says, "Jungles today are gold mines tomorrow. Growing markets for our goods." And then we see goods we sold, goods we received, and you're going to notice in most years we're selling more than we're receiving. Okay, in other words, we're selling more than we're buying from the colonies. And if you have a positive difference here, then that means you're making money off your colonies, which is our second reason. Countries across Europe built empires across the world because they had a need for raw materials, but also a market for their goods. So as these countries brought raw materials in from across the world, in their factories, of course, they'll be turned into manufactured goods that can be sold back to their empire. So this is an example of one of those resources. It's called palm oil. It comes from the palm fruit. So yeah, that's the kind of the fatty stuff there that you can extract as oil and used. It can be used for cooking. It can also be used for like lubrication in industrial machines, of which of course there are a lot back in Europe. Here's another resource, and this one's you're familiar with, but you may not be familiar with it from this picture. Believe it or not, this is rubber. This is a rubber tree, and they've tapped the tree, and the natural rubber here is kind of seeping out and being collected in that bucket. All right, reason number 3 that Europeans are building empires: to spread their culture and religion. Europeans believed that their culture was superior. They thought their religion was the only religion, really, that should be followed around the world. That's, of course, Christianity when we're talking about Europeans. And so by taking over these countries, they felt that they were spreading that culture, but also helping them in the same process, that people who didn't have European culture now would, and because of that, they would be helped. This is the mindset of the Europeans at the time. And so we have in our picture some missionaries being, they're out looking around, trying to find people to spread their faith to. They're going to be spreading out across Latin America, Africa, Asia, all over the place. These missionaries will go. And this particular missionary right here, we are going to talk more about him in our next section. Dr. Livingstone is his name, and that'll come back to our memory here in a little bit. All right, reason number 4 imperialism is occurring is something called social Darwinism. So way back when, in our second unit on the Industrial Revolution, we covered social Darwinism. But you may have forgotten, guys. So social Darwinism is basically this idea where we're going to apply Darwin's theory of natural selection to the world around us. And we're going to notice that there are people who are rich and successful, and there are people who are poor and unsuccessful. And a social Darwinist would explain that by saying those who are rich and successful are just a member of the species, and those who are not are lesser members of the species. And so therefore, according to social Darwinism, Europeans saw non-Europeans as lesser beings because they lacked European skills and technology and scientific progress. And so they're going to use this as a justification to take lands from others. In other words, we're Europeans, we've got, we're using electricity, we have steamships, we've got telegraph and all this stuff, and they didn't see that around the globe, and so they would look at others that didn't have those technologies and see them as inferior and thus fair game to take over their lands. We can see that viewpoint here in a quote from Cecil Rhodes, a famous British imperialist. He said that I contend that we Britons are the first race in the world, and the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. It is our duty to seize every opportunity of acquiring more territory. So we're the best people in the world, and we must take lands from others. All right, now tied into the idea of social Darwinism is another concept we're going to explore a lot in this unit. It's called paternalism. Paternalism is this idea that Europeans saw non-Europeans as basically nothing more than kids. Little children who need to be guided, need to be led by the hand, need to be shown because they're not equal of Europeans. The Europeans are the adults in the room, and non-Europeans are the little kids. That's the viewpoint that an imperialist probably would be projecting. We can see that in this political cartoon. There's Uncle Sam, and he's teaching all these different people here from around the globe because, again, they're the children and the Western people are the adults, according to paternalism. All right, our next reason as to why Europeans are building colonies involves this ship right here, nice, pretty battleship. What's powering this ship is the question, and what it is, of course, is, well, it's a steamship. Steam power, which means you need lots and lots of coal to burn. So for our 5th reason for building European colonies overseas is the need for overseas military bases. coaling stations to allow ships to refuel, bases to house soldiers so they can defend the existing colonies or expand those colonies by attacking outward in whatever direction they're needed. So basically planting your flag somewhere around the globe and having a little military base. And as you can see from the map, the British did this a lot. They've got naval bases just ringing the oceans here by the year 1900. All right, so let's now that we know why they're building colonies, the Europeans, why are they so successful? What would account for that success? And, well, a lot of it has to do with technology. So let's get into main idea number 2. Now, before we get to the technology part, though, let's do a little bit of politics. If you look at world history, the different parts of the world have kind of had ups and downs in terms of power and prestige and technology, what have you. And at this particular time in history, late 1800s, the Europeans really were basically at their peak. And it's also a time where Asia and Africa tended to be on the weak side, comparatively speaking. They're also, divided regions, Africa and Asia. There's different religions and ethnic groups and languages all competing. And so it turns out Europeans had a big upper hand because they're going up against weaker and more divided opponents. And speaking of weakness, as a throwback to our last unit, this, of course, is the Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe. And you notice how the Europeans are taking advantage of his weakness by taking land from him. By far, though, the number one reason why Europeans are successful, it's all about technology. So that whole unit we spent on the Industrial Revolution, those technologies can make life really good and efficient. It can also make it a lot easier to overpower your potential rivals and enemies. So the Europeans had good medicine to keep their soldiers healthy while they're overseas. They had better means of transportation, move their soldiers around. They had new weapons like the Maxim gun, which is a machine gun that are going to overwhelm the enemy. They also have means of communication to send messages rapidly around the globe to expand their power. And so if you put all this together, what you're going to find out is a relatively small number of Europeans can control large numbers of people across the globe because they just are so much more advanced in technology than their Asian or African enemies. Again, Maxim gun, repeating rifles, pistols and things, a cowhide shield and a spear, that's just no match for this type of firepower. Alright guys, so in our first video in this new unit, we figured out why imperialism is happening. We talked about all the causes, whether it's social Darwinism, the desire for markets and resources, the competition and nationalism. We also looked at why the Europeans are successful. Asians and Africans tend to be weaker in this point in history and more divided, more easily conquered, in other words. And of course, the Europeans bring to the table lots of advanced technologies. In our next video, we're going to go into a little bit more depth into Africa specifically and see what's going on there in terms of imperialism.